Okay, so what I'd like to do is pick up where I think about where people are in lecture. So I know some groups are getting to this point here with respiration. I want to discuss pulmonary ventilation. Pulmo means lung, and ventilation means the movement of gases. So with pulmonary ventilation, it's just a fancy physiological term for breathing. You breathe in, you breathe out. You breathe in, you breathe out. That differs from respirations. Respirations are about gas exchange. So again, pulmonary ventilation is just breathing, and then respiration is where you're swapping out gases. Now, with external respiration, you're swapping out gases between your alveoli and your bloodstream. And then with internal respiration, that happens internally around the body where you're exchanging gases between your capillary beds and your cells. Okay? So pulmonary ventilation is breathing, and then respirations are gas exchange that happens externally in your lungs or internally in the capillary beds around your body. Now, when we breathe, it really is driven by volume changes. When you increase the volume inside your chest, the pressure drops, and so that causes air to flow in. When you decrease the volume on your chest, the pressure increases and that forces air out. So, what you do is you use your muscles to increase your thoracic volume. The volume increases, pressure drops, and air flows in. Then, because the tissues are elastic, when you relax, things just go back to their original size. The pressure increases and that forces air out. So, gases are going to flow from high to low pressure. So, when you change the volume of your chest, you're changing the pressure in your chest, and that causes air to flow in or out. All right, so here's a question. I think the numbers got out of sequence a little bit. So there's a paper that got passed out the other day. You can use that to uh, write down your answers to this question. It says, what's the relationship between the percentages of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the external air composed of concentrations of the gases found in the capillaries, concentrations of the gases in the capillaries found in the alveoli? Okay, so the idea is you have a higher concentration of the oxygen in the air than you do in the capillaries in your lungs. So oxygen flows into the capillaries in your lungs. You have a higher concentration of carbon dioxide in the capillaries in your blood than you do in the air, so that carbon dioxide is forced out. So the idea is, in your blood, you'll have more CO2 and less oxygen. So you take oxygen, you force CO2 out. All right, looking at the idea of inspiration, what happens is the diaphragm is this muscle at the base of your thoracic cage, and it's normally dome shaped. When it contracts, that flattens out. So when you're breathing, your diaphragm contracts and flattens. And additionally, the intercostal muscles between your ribs contract, and between those two things, you open your rib cage up and you flatten the diaphragm, and that increases your intrapulmonary volume. So the space inside your rib cage increases, and when that happens, the pressure drops. Okay, so that leads to inspiration. Now with expiration, those intercostal muscles relax, so your rib cage drops back down. Your diaphragm relaxes, so it goes back to that dome shape. And then what that does is everything goes back to its original volume. When that happens, the pressure goes up and air is forced out. Now, one problem people can have with this is if they have asthma. If you have asthma, you can get those bronchioles, the little tubes that air travels through, the conducting passageways, they can narrow. So if a person is having an asthma attack, if these passageways narrow, then it's harder to force that air out, and you can actually get air trapped in their lungs. So that's when people might use a rescue inhaler. A rescue inhaler is a bronchodilator. It relaxes the smooth muscles in the bronchioles so they open back up and a person can continue breathing. All right, here's a question. What role do muscles play? What role do muscles and tissue elasticity play in inspiration and expiration? Well, when muscles contract, like your intercostal muscles, it increases the volume in your thoracic cage, so pressure drops and air flows in. When the muscles relax, the rib cage drops back down to its original size, increasing pressure. Additionally, when the muscles relax, the elastic tissues in the bronchioles go back to their original size, and then that increases the pressure and forces the air out. All right, so now let's look at gas exchange and the volumes of air that can be exchanged during breathing. So tidal breathing is what you're doing right now. Just as you're sitting there, you're exchanging about 500 mils of air with each breath. Okay. So I just think of it as like the tides. Tides go in, tides come in, tides go out. Tides come in, tides go out. And so with tidal breathing, just air goes in and out. And when you do that, you're exchanging about 500 mils of air with each breath. Now, could you breathe in more? Sure. That's called your inspiratory reserve volume. So your inspiratory reserve volume is that extra air you can breathe in. So, big breath in, you can take in about 3,000 mils of air. Additionally, when you're breathing, could you also force some extra air out? Yeah, it's called your expiratory reserve volume. So your expiratory reserve volume is that extra air you can push out, and that's about 1,200 mils. So between your inspiratory reserve and your expiratory reserve and your tidal volume, it's about 5 liters of air. So that's quite a bit of air that you could force through your lungs. So again, you got 500 in a tidal breath. You could take in about another 3,000 with your big breath in, and another 1,200 with big breath out. So again, on average, a person can move about 5 liters of air. Now, there is what's called your residual volume. The residual volume is the air that's always left in your lungs. You always have some air in your lungs because if all the air got forced out, what would happen? Your lungs would collapse, right? So you always have this residual volume in your lungs to help keep your lungs expanded or open. All right, so here is a way to sort of visualize this. Here's your tidal volume. Again, that's your normal breathing. You have your extra air in, that's your inspiratory reserve volume or your IRV. And then you have the extra air you can force out, which is your expiratory reserve volume or your other IRV. Okay. So all that taken in total is called your vital capacity or VC. So vital capacity is basically the total amount of air you can pass in and out of your lungs. It's your tidal breathing, your inspiratory reserve, and then your expiratory reserve. Okay, so what is vital capacity and how's it calculated? Okay, there we go. Vital capacity, it's the total amount of air that you can exchange in your lungs. And vital capacity equals your tidal volume plus your inspiratory reserve plus your expiratory reserve. So it's everything you can move. Okay, so now let's look at some ideas related to physiology, which David Blaine understands. Here are some non-respiratory air movements. We can move air for different reasons, like clearing lower respiratory passageways, sneezing, crying, all this stuff. We'll watch these clips when I get back another time. There are also sounds that can be made. So if you've gone to the doctor and they're listening to your breathing with the stethoscope, they're checking out that kind of stuff. So again, we'll listen to that when I get back. Let's see. Now, there are gases that are found in your blood. We know carbon dioxide and oxygen are the gases we need to exchange. Oxygen is usually carried in hemoglobin, and carbon dioxide is also carried in hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin will normally prefer oxygen, but when it dumps it off, it'll pick up that carbon dioxide. But here's the kicker. You can also dissolve carbon dioxide directly into your blood. So when that happens, it will form this bicarb, which sort of acts like a buffer. But if you keep adding more carbon dioxide to your blood, you can actually form carbonic acid and acidify your blood. So that's the big driver for why you feel like you have to breathe. Like if you've been swimming in the water and you're holding your breath and you're like, oh my gosh, I got to breathe. That drive to breathe is caused by your blood acidifying as CO2 builds up in your blood. Or if you've been exercising and you're running or lifting heavy weights and you got to do some breathing, that's because there's more CO2 in your blood and your blood's becoming more acidic. So your body's like, I got to get this pH back to 7.4, which is homeostasis. Okay, time to look at the terrible things that can happen. So hypoxia. Hypo is below, oxia is in reference to blood oxygenation. So with hypoxia, you have a decrease in the oxygen concentration in blood, and so that can lead to cyanosis. I remember cyan is blue, So that could be like a bluish cast in the lips or in the fingertips, whatever the case may be. So your circulation issues could be caused for a whole host of reasons. But the idea is if you're not getting enough oxygen, you're going to get that bluish tone. Okay, here's another issue that can occur. It's carbon monoxide. Now, oxygen normally binds to hemoglobin and gets carried around the body. If the body gets rid of oxygen, then they can pick up carbon dioxide. So, like, oxygen binds really well. Carbon dioxide binds less well to hemoglobin. But there is a molecule that can outcompete oxygen for access to that hemoglobin, and that is carbon monoxide. So carbon monoxide, or CO, is produced when you burn fuels. So when you burn those fuels, carbon monoxide is released, and it can actually replace oxygen. When that happens, then a person doesn't get oxygen delivered to tissues. They might feel dizzy and woozy and pass out and then die. Okay, so that's why carbon monoxide is referred to as a quiet killer, because people may not realize it. So that's why homes, it's recommended to not only have smoke detectors. Get a fire extinguisher if you want. But it's good to have smoke detectors. But it's also good to have carbon monoxide detectors because it can sense if you're having problems with like a gas furnace or a fireplace or something like that, and alert you to build up carbon monoxide. All right. How do we control breathing? There is a nerve. One of the cranial nerves is the phrenic nerve. So the phrenic nerve runs from your brain down to your diaphragm, and it tells the diaphragm how often to contract. The medulla and pons in your brainstem also play a role with that. Again, you're breathing usually about 15 times a minute. So you can change the rate at which you breathe. And you can also change the depth of your breaths. So you can, you might still only take maybe 15 or 20 breaths a minute, but you're taking bigger breaths and you're exchanging more gas. All right. So what goes on with changing the rate of breathing? One way to change breathing rate is what's called volition. That's conscious control. So you can decide, I'm going to take some long, slow breaths, or you can control your breathing as you're singing, right? That's all volition. So conscious control of your breathing. Breathing rates can be changed with strong emotion. So if you're startled, you can gasp and take in a lot of air. A big driver for breathing is chemicals. Again, if you have more CO2 in your blood becomes more acidic. And so your body's like, man, I've got to get rid of that CO2. So you start breathing faster. Now, people can also hyperventilate. With hyperventilating, you are breathing really quickly and you're blowing more CO2 out. So that can actually raise the pH of your blood. So that's why if a person's hyperventilating, they might breathe into a paper bag because they're rebreathing some of that air and breathing some more CO2 back in and bring themselves back to homeostasis. Another issue that you can have with your respiratory system is COPD. It's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So, with COPD, you can have damage to the air sacs, the alveoli in the lungs. So when that happens, you are going to certainly have issues with gas exchange. So that can lead to dyspnea or painful breathing and the coughing that can occur. If you lose some of this elasticity in the lungs, you're more likely to be prone to infection. And again, with poor oxygen circulation, you get that hypoxia. Let's see, what can increase or decrease the rate of external respirations? That is what we should say with this rather than external respiration is pulmonary ventilation. So there'd be an improvement for that. But here are your rate changers. So you can do it consciously because of emotion. If you increase or decrease the acidity of your blood, or if you're hyperventilating. So that's the answer for that one. Okay, emphysema. This is another interesting thing that can happen if you have damage to your lungs. If you have chronic inflammation in your lungs, you can actually lose the elasticity of your lungs. So normally, the air, your lungs stretch out, and then because of elasticity, it goes back to its normal size, and that helps force air out. But with emphysema, if you lose that elasticity, you actually have to engage your abdominal muscles to try and force that air out. So people expend a lot more energy trying to just breathe because they lose that elasticity. So the big thing is both COPD and emphysema are caused by smoking. So smoking is definitely a rough thing for your respiratory system. And then finally, we finish with lung cancer. You don't need to write down like all the stats on it, but lung cancer is pretty rough. The deal is you don't have nerve endings in your lungs, so you can have a tumor growing in your lungs and not feel it. It's not until it starts to push on other organs that you would sense that pain potentially. So a lot of times by the time people get lung cancer detected, it's fairly far along. So survival rates are pretty low. But the big deal here is mutations in DNA. And the driver for that is exposure to chemicals from smoking. So smoking is definitely not a great thing for your lung health. Now, one question that people do come up with is vaping, and what does vaping do with this? More longitudinal research is needed to sort of understand the full ramifications of vaping. But what they know is that what is in the little containers or vials or whatever they're called, when it is heated and vaporized, there are chemical reactions that occur. So what is in the little vial is one thing, and then what's created to make that vapor that you breathe in is something that's chemically different. And so they're still finding like formaldehydes and other stuff that are known carcinogens in vapes. So what does that do to odds of lung cancer? Well, again, they need time to figure out what happens with that. So we'll have a better sense of just what kind of risk is involved with vaping in the coming years. But we know that there are still carcinogenic chemicals that people breathe in through vapes. So there's no free lunch with that. All right, so that's what we have for the lecture here. What I'd like to do now is sort of turn our attention to what you're going to do as a follow-up activity. So we've got this haiku assignment. You have your lecture notes that you'll complete. Then what you're going to do is write a haiku. Now, I'm going to link these instructions for writing a haiku. It's basically 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. And it sort of talks about a concept or idea. Now, around your little haiku, you're going to make some quick border art. Don't spend more than 60 seconds on that. And then just a short, like 1 paragraph, 3 to 5 sentence explanation talking about your haiku and border art relate to whatever topic you choose. Okay? So that's the assignment. You're going to make a written haiku, do a little bit of border art, and then just have a 1 paragraph explanation. And I'm putting together this assignment in Canvas. So here you have, again, do the lecture notes. I'll have this posted here. After doing the lecture notes, you're going to write the haiku, do the visual, and then a short explanation about how your haiku and border art relate to your topic. This will be due on Wednesday. So you have Tuesday to complete it. Please post it to Canvas by Wednesday. If you have any questions on anything, just let me know. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.